Pack your things, Mom. You're not in the will anymore, and honestly, you've become a burden. My son said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather, like the words didn't carry the weight of 72 years of my life pressed quietly into that dining room chair. I remember the exact way the light from the chandelier hit the polished wood table, how it reflected off the silverware I had set out just an hour earlier, the same silverware I had used for every family dinner since my husband, Thomas, brought it home as an anniversary gift nearly 40 years ago. I didn't respond right away. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask him how he could say something like that. Instead, I looked at him. Really looked. At the man I had raised, the boy who used to run into my arms after school, who once cried because he thought I might leave him when I went on a weekend trip. That boy was gone. Sitting across from me was Daniel Collins, 45 years old, successful, composed, and completely unmoved by the woman who had given him everything. Rebecca sat beside him, her posture straight, her expression carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes I recognized instantly. Not guilt. Not discomfort. Calculation. She didn't interrupt him. She didn't soften his words. She simply reached for her glass of water and took a slow sip, as if this conversation had already been rehearsed, decided, finalized long before I sat down at that table. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the fork in my hand, but I made sure my voice, when it finally came, was steady. I see, I said, placing the fork down beside my plate with a quiet, deliberate motion. No one rushed to explain. No one corrected him. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had said. It told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a moment of frustration. This wasn't something said in anger. This was a decision. A conclusion they had both reached together. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse out of habit more than necessity. The room felt different when I was standing, like I no longer belonged in it, like I had already been erased from the space I had spent decades building. You should start looking at places, Rebecca added, her voice softer than Daniel's but no less final. Somewhere, more manageable. Manageable. The word echoed in my mind as I picked up my napkin and folded it neatly beside my untouched plate. This house had never been too much for me. Not when I balanced bills, raised a child, cared for a husband, and kept everything running without complaint. But now, suddenly, I was too old. Too slow. Too much. A burden. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I understood. There was nothing left to discuss. I turned and walked out of the dining room without another word, my steps steady, measured, controlled. The hallway was dim compared to the brightness of the dining room, and for a moment, I allowed myself to pause, resting my hand lightly against the wall where family photos lined the corridor. Birthdays. Holidays. Smiling faces frozen in time. Proof of a life that, until recently, I believed had meant something. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after something irreversible has been said. I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door behind me, not slamming it, just enough to separate myself from the voices downstairs that had already begun to move on without me. My eyes drifted to the dresser where Thomas's watch still rested, exactly where he had left it the night before he passed. He had always been careful, thoughtful, protective in ways that didn't need to be spoken out loud. I walked over slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the wood before I picked up the watch, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. You made sure I'd be okay, I whispered, not expecting an answer, but feeling something settle deep inside me all the same. Because there was something about Daniel's confidence that didn't sit right with me. Something about the way he said it, like everything had already been transferred, finalized, secured. Like there was nothing left for me. And yet, Thomas had never been careless. Not with our life. Not with me. I placed the watch back down exactly where it had been and straightened up, my reflection staring back at me from the mirror across the room. Older, yes. Tired, maybe. But not powerless. Not yet. Downstairs, I could hear the faint clink of dishes, the low murmur of voices continuing as if nothing significant had just happened. As if I had already been removed from the story. I didn't go back down. Instead, I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the garden Thomas and I had planted together years ago, still standing, still growing, untouched by the decision that had just been made at the dinner table. They thought I was finished. They thought they had already taken everything. But standing there, in the quiet of that room, I realized something they didn't know. Something they had never bothered to question. I hadn't lost anything. They had just assumed I had. I did not sleep that night, not because I was surprised by what Daniel had said, but because something in his certainty felt incomplete, like a sentence that ended too cleanly to be true, and as the hours passed, I lay still in the darkness of my bedroom, listening to the quiet hum of the house that had once been filled with warmth, replaying every detail of that dinner in my mind, the way he avoided my eyes until the moment he delivered his verdict, the way Rebecca had not flinched, not even once, as if she had already moved past me in her mind, already rearranged the future without me in it, and the more I thought about it, the more a quiet unease began to settle in my chest, not panic, not fear, but something sharper, something more focused, because Daniel had always been confident, but he had never been careless, and yet there was a kind of carelessness in the way he spoke that night, a kind of finality that did not match the man I knew he had become, and that was what kept me awake, staring at the ceiling long after the house had gone silent, until the faint light of early morning began to filter through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room that Thomas and I had shared for decades, and for the first time since his passing, I felt something shift inside me, not grief, not exactly, but clarity, and when I finally rose from the bed, I did so slowly, deliberately, as if every movement mattered now, as if every decision from this moment forward carried weight, and I dressed with the same care I had always taken, selecting a simple blouse, smoothing it over my shoulders, brushing my silver hair until it lay neatly in place, not because anyone would notice, but because I would, and that still mattered. Then I walked downstairs, the scent of last night's dinner lingering faintly in the air, the dishes already cleaned, the table cleared, as if nothing significant had happened, as if the words spoken at that table had not altered the course of everything, and for a moment, I stood there in the kitchen, looking at the space that had once been the center of our family, remembering the countless mornings I had stood in that same spot preparing breakfast, packing lunches, listening to Daniel talk about school, about dreams that once included me, and I let that memory settle, not to dwell on it, but to understand how far things had shifted. Then I reached for my coffee cup, poured myself a cup with steady hands, and sat down at the small table by the window, watching the sunlight stretch across the backyard, illuminating the garden Thomas and I had planted together, still untouched, still thriving, and it was there, in that quiet moment, that the thought returned to me, clearer now, sharper. The memory of a conversation Thomas and I had shared years ago, one that at the time had felt almost unnecessary, because we had always trusted that things would remain simple. But Thomas had never believed in leaving things to chance. I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were standing beside me, calm and certain, telling me that everything had been arranged, that no matter what happened, I would always be protected, and at the time, I had smiled, trusting him without asking for details, because I never needed to question him. But now, sitting there with Daniel's words still echoing in my mind, that memory no longer felt like a reassurance, it felt like a clue. And I realized then that I had accepted Daniel's version of events too quickly, that I had allowed his confidence to define the situation without ever verifying it myself, and that was not like me, not anymore. So I finished my coffee slowly, set the cup down with quiet precision, and stood up, my mind already moving ahead, already considering what needed to be done, because if there was even the slightest possibility that something had been overlooked, something Daniel did not fully understand, then I needed to find out, not out of desperation, but out of certainty. And as I walked toward the hallway, passing the framed photographs that told the story of a family I barely recognized anymore, I felt that same calm settle over me again, the same quiet steadiness that had carried me through every difficult moment of my life, and I understood something then that Daniel had not considered, something Rebecca had underestimated. They believed the story was already finished, that the outcome had already been decided, but I had lived long enough to know that the truth does not reveal itself to those who assume they already have it, it reveals itself to those who are willing to look closely. And I was ready to look. The drive to the attorney's office felt shorter than I remembered, though I took the same route Thomas and I had driven countless times over the years, passing the same grocery store on the corner, the same gas station where he used to insist on checking the tire pressure himself, The same quiet park where we once sat on a wooden bench and talked about everything that mattered and everything that did not, and yet that morning, everything looked slightly different, as if I was seeing it all through a clearer lens, one that no longer softened reality with assumptions or comfort. And when I pulled into the parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because I understood that whatever I learned inside that building would either confirm what Daniel believed or unravel it completely, and I was prepared for either outcome. Then I stepped out, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the entrance with steady, measured steps, the glass doors reflecting a version of me that felt quieter, sharper, more aware than the woman who had sat at that dinner table the night before. And inside, the receptionist greeted me politely, her smile professional, unaware of the significance this visit held for me, and I gave my name, Margaret Collins. Hearing it spoken aloud in that space grounded me in a way I had not expected, as if reminding me that I still existed beyond the roles others had assigned to me. And after a brief wait, I was led into a familiar office, one that smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, where shelves lined with neatly organized files stood as silent witnesses to decisions that shaped entire lives. And when Mr. Howard Bennett entered, he paused for just a fraction of a second when he saw me, not out of surprise, but recognition, the kind that comes from years of professional trust, and he offered a warm but measured greeting, asking how I had been, and I answered simply, telling him I needed clarification about my late husband's arrangements, choosing my words carefully, not revealing more than necessary, because I wanted to hear the truth without influence. And he nodded, taking a seat across from me, his demeanor shifting slightly into the focused attention of someone who understood the importance of precision. Then he opened a file, one I recognized immediately by its worn edges, a file that had been prepared years ago, long before illness, long before loss, back when Thomas had insisted on putting everything in order with a calm certainty I had trusted without question. And as Mr. Bennett began to speak, explaining the structure of the estate, the language was formal, measured, but beneath it, there was clarity, and I listened carefully, every word settling into place like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was assembling, because what he described did not align with what Daniel had declared, not even close. And when I asked, as evenly as I could, about the will, about ownership, about control, Mr. Bennett did not hesitate. He turned the file slightly toward me, pointing to specific documents, explaining that while there was indeed a will, it was only one part of a larger structure, a structure Thomas had deliberately designed to ensure stability, to prevent exactly the kind of situation I now found myself in. And as he continued, the details became unmistakable, the assets, the house, the accounts, they were not simply passed down in the way Daniel seemed to believe, they were protected, placed within a trust that named me not as a dependent, not as an afterthought, but as the primary controller, the one with authority, the one with final say. And for a moment, I said nothing, not because I was shocked, but because I was confirming something I had already begun to suspect, that Daniel's confidence had been built on incomplete information, that his certainty was not based on fact, but assumption. And Mr. Bennett looked at me then, perhaps expecting a reaction, perhaps expecting relief or confusion, but I simply nodded, absorbing the information with the same calm I had carried into the room, because now everything made sense, the haste, the dismissal, the urgency in Rebecca's tone, they were moving forward under the belief that everything had already been secured in their favor, and that belief was wrong, completely and entirely wrong. And as I closed the file gently and thanked Mr. Bennett for his time, I felt no need to explain my situation, no need to share what had been said at that dinner table, because the truth did not require validation, it simply existed. And as I stood to leave, the weight I carried was no longer uncertainty, it was knowledge, and knowledge, I had learned over a lifetime, did not need to announce itself loudly to be powerful, it only needed to be used at the right moment. And as I stepped back into the daylight, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if the world had shifted back into alignment. And I realized then that Daniel had not taken anything from me, he had only revealed how little he truly understood about what he believed he controlled, and that realization changed everything. When I returned home that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I no longer saw it the same way, because now every detail carried a different meaning, every wall, every piece of furniture, every quiet corner held a truth that Daniel and Rebecca had completely misunderstood. And as I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, I could hear their voices coming from the kitchen, low and casual, as if nothing in their world had shifted, as if the future they had already planned was still firmly in place, and I paused just long enough to listen, not out of curiosity, but out of clarity, because what they said next told me exactly how confident they believed themselves to be. Rebecca's voice came first, calm and assured, talking about timelines, about paperwork, about listing the house sooner rather than later, while Daniel responded with quiet agreement, his tone steady, certain, as if he were discussing something already owned, already decided, and I stood there for a moment, letting their words settle, not feeling anger, not even disappointment, but something colder, something more precise. Because now I understood the full picture, they were not just pushing me out, they were already moving forward with what they believed was theirs, and that belief was built entirely on a foundation that did not exist, and that realization did not overwhelm me, it focused me, it sharpened something inside me that had been quiet for far too long. So I stepped into the kitchen, my expression calm, my movements unhurried, and their conversation stopped almost immediately. Daniel glanced at me briefly, then away, as if maintaining distance would make everything easier, while Rebecca offered a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile reserved for someone who is no longer considered part of the inner circle, and I walked to the counter, placing my keys down gently, as if nothing had changed, as if I had accepted everything exactly as they intended. I will start making arrangements, I said, my voice even, controlled, and I saw the faintest flicker of relief pass between them, quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm that they had expected resistance, and were now reassured by its absence. Daniel nodded, not looking directly at me. That would be best, he replied, his tone measured, as though he were handling a situation that required efficiency rather than emotion, and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging his words without challenging them, because there was no need, not yet. Then I turned toward the hallway, continuing up the stairs with the same steady pace, aware that every step I took reinforced the image they had already constructed of me, compliant, resigned, finished, and once inside my bedroom, I closed the door softly and allowed the silence to settle around me, not as a place of retreat, but as a space of preparation, because now that I knew the truth, now that I understood exactly where I stood, every decision mattered, every action had purpose, and I moved through the room with quiet intention, opening drawers, looking at the things I had accumulated over a lifetime, not with nostalgia, but with clarity, selecting only what I would need, what I would take with me, not because I had been forced to leave, but because I had chosen to move forward on my own terms. And as I folded my clothes carefully, placing them into a suitcase that had once been used for family vacations, I found myself remembering the way Thomas used to pack, methodical, thoughtful, never rushed, always prepared, and that memory grounded me, reminding me that preparation was not weakness, it was strength, and I continued, piece by piece, organizing what mattered, leaving behind what did not because I was losing anything, but because I no longer needed to carry what others believed they had taken from me. And when I finally paused, standing in the center of the room, I looked around once more, not with sadness, but with understanding, because this house, this life, everything within it, had never truly belonged to the version of events Daniel had imagined, and soon, he would learn that, but not through confrontation, not through anger, through something far more effective, timing. And as I closed the suitcase and set it by the door, I felt that same calm settle over me again, steady, unshaken, because they believed I was leaving with nothing, and I was allowing them to believe it, for now. The next morning began with a kind of quiet efficiency that I had not felt in years, not rushed, not anxious, but deliberate, as if every small action I took was part of something larger that only I could see. And I moved through the house with the same calm routine I had followed for decades, making my coffee, opening the curtains, letting the early sunlight spill across the kitchen floor, but now there was a difference in the way I observed everything, a detachment that allowed me to see not just what was there, but what was about to change. And as I sat at the table, I noticed a stack of papers near the counter that had not been there before, neatly aligned, official-looking, placed just slightly out of place for someone like Rebecca, who usually kept everything perfectly arranged, and I did not need to pick them up to understand what they were. The timing alone made it obvious, and still, I reached for them with steady hands, lifting the top page just enough to confirm what I already suspected: preliminary listing documents, estimates, timelines, language that assumed ownership, that assumed authority, that assumed I was no longer part of the equation, and I set them back. exactly where I had found them, not disturbed, not questioned, because there was no need to react, not yet, and as I turned away, I could hear footsteps approaching, Rebecca entering the kitchen with that same composed expression, though this time there was something slightly sharper in her posture, a quiet anticipation, as if she were waiting to see whether I had noticed, whether I would challenge what had already been set in motion, but I did not give her that moment. I simply rinsed my cup, placed it in the sink, and reached for my purse. I have a few things to take care of today, I said calmly, my voice carrying no trace of suspicion, no hint of resistance, and she nodded, her eyes flickering briefly toward the papers before returning to me. Of course, she replied, her tone polite, but beneath it, I could sense the calculation continuing, always continuing, and as I walked past her, I felt it clearly now, the shift in roles they believed had already taken place. In their minds, I was no longer the center of this home, no longer the one who made decisions. I was an obligation being managed, a situation being resolved, and I allowed that belief to remain exactly as it was, untouched, unchallenged, because it was serving a purpose, and outside, the air was crisp, carrying that early morning stillness that often goes unnoticed, but that day, I noticed everything, the sound of distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, the way the sky stretched open without interruption, and I got into my car, closing the door with the same quiet precision that had become my rhythm, and as I drove, I was not escaping, I was aligning, moving each piece into place, because knowledge alone was not enough, timing mattered, structure mattered, and I knew exactly where I needed to go next, not out of urgency, but out of certainty, and when I arrived at the bank, the building stood unchanged, familiar, a place I had trusted for years without needing to question it, and inside, the atmosphere was calm, professional, removed from the quiet tension of the house I had just left, and I approached the desk, giving my name once more, Margaret Collins, watching as recognition settled across the face of the manager who had worked with Thomas for years, and there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a respect that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with understanding, and I requested a full review of the accounts, the trust, the documents that defined ownership, and as we sat down together, going through each detail with care, everything aligned exactly as Mr. Bennett had explained, the structure, the authority, the control, all of it remained firmly where Thomas had intended it to be, with me, not as a formality, not as a placeholder, but as the one who held the final decision, and I listened, asked precise questions, confirmed what needed to be confirmed, not because I doubted, but because certainty required verification, and when it was done, when every detail had been reviewed and understood, I thanked him, stood up, and walked out with the same composed expression I had carried in. But now, there was no uncertainty left, no unanswered question lingering in the back of my mind, only clarity, and as I returned to my car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the wheel, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition, because everything was now exactly where it needed to be. They believed they were moving forward, they believed they were in control, and I was allowing that belief to continue, because soon, very soon, they would act on it, and when they did, when they stepped fully into a position they did not actually hold, that would be the moment everything changed, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with truth presented at precisely the right time, and I started the car, already knowing that the next step would not require force, only patience. By the time I returned home, the house was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that does not come from peace but from anticipation, as if something unseen was already shifting beneath the surface, and I stepped inside without hesitation, closing the door gently behind me, noticing immediately that the energy in the space had changed, subtle but unmistakable, because Daniel and Rebecca were no longer speaking in low, private tones, they were moving openly now, more freely, as though whatever restraint they had maintained before was no longer necessary, and I could hear them in the living room, discussing numbers, timelines, phrases like market value and quick turnaround drifting into the hallway without any attempt to lower their voices, and I paused just long enough to understand the direction they were heading, not to interrupt, not to challenge, but to confirm that everything was unfolding exactly as I expected. Then I walked past the doorway, allowing them to see me, and their conversation faltered for only a moment before continuing, Daniel giving a brief nod in my direction, acknowledging my presence without inviting it, while Rebecca offered a polite smile that carried a quiet sense of finality, as if she believed the outcome had already been secured, and I returned that smile with the same calm composure I had maintained all along, because there was no advantage in revealing anything too soon. I spoke with someone today about moving arrangements, I said. My tone even, measured, and I saw it again, that flicker of relief, stronger this time, less guarded, because now they believed I was not only accepting their decision, I was acting on it, and Daniel exhaled slightly, a small release of tension he probably did not even realize he had been holding. That is good, he replied, his voice steady, practical, as if we were discussing logistics rather than the dismantling of a lifetime, and I inclined my head, offering no further details, because details were not for them, not yet, and I continued up the stairs, aware that behind me, their conversation resumed almost immediately, picking up where it had left off, confident, uninterrupted, and that confidence told me everything I needed to know. They were no longer questioning whether they would succeed, they were planning how quickly they could move forward, and that was exactly what I needed, because certainty makes people careless, and carelessness reveals everything. And inside my room, I moved with the same quiet purpose, checking the suitcase I had prepared, adding a few final items, not because I was in a hurry, but because I was creating the appearance of someone who was leaving permanently, someone who had already accepted defeat. And as I zipped the suitcase closed, I took a moment to look around the room once more, not with attachment, but with clarity, understanding that nothing in this space had truly been taken from me, only misunderstood, and that misunderstanding was about to become very important. Then I carried the suitcase downstairs, each step steady, unhurried, and when I reached the bottom, Daniel looked up, his expression neutral, almost detached, while Rebecca watched more closely, her eyes tracking every movement, every signal, as if she were measuring whether everything was proceeding according to her expectations. I will be staying at a hotel for a few days, I said calmly, setting the suitcase near the door, and Rebecca nodded immediately, too quickly. That sounds like a good idea, she replied, her tone smooth, supportive in a way that felt practiced, and Daniel simply added, let us know if you need anything, though his voice carried no real intention behind it, and I met his gaze for a brief moment, long enough to see that he believed what he was saying, believed that whatever role I had played in his life had already come to an end, and I gave a small nod in return, not correcting him, not challenging that belief, because it was serving its purpose perfectly. Then I reached for the handle of my suitcase, opened the door, and stepped outside, the late afternoon air cool against my skin, and as I walked to my car, I felt no hesitation, no doubt, only a steady sense of direction, because everything was now in place. They believed I was gone, they believed the house was theirs to manage, to sell, to control, and I was allowing them to act on that belief, because once they did, once they moved forward without questioning their authority, that would be the moment the truth would no longer be something I held quietly, it would become something they could not ignore. And as I placed the suitcase into the trunk and closed it gently, I understood that leaving this house was not an ending, it was a step, a necessary one, and as I got into the driver's seat and started the engine, I did not look back, because I did not need to. Everything I needed was already moving forward with me, and soon, very soon, they would realize that nothing had ever been theirs to take. The hotel room was smaller than my bedroom at home, but it was quiet in a way that felt different, not empty, not abandoned, but controlled, as if every inch of the space belonged entirely to me and no one else, and I placed my suitcase on the stand near the window, unzipping it slowly, not because I needed anything from inside, but because the act itself grounded me, reminded me that I was not displaced, I had simply moved, and as I stepped back, looking around the room, I allowed myself a moment of stillness, not to question what I had done, but to observe what was coming next, because for the first time since that dinner, everything was unfolding exactly as I had intended, and I reached for my phone, not out of habit, but with purpose, scrolling through recent notifications until I found what I was looking for, an email confirmation, one that had arrived just minutes earlier, and I opened it calmly, reading the subject line without any change in expression, a preliminary listing notice, the house address clearly stated, the estimated value outlined in precise numbers, and I read it once, then again, not because I doubted what I was seeing, but because I understood what it meant. They had moved forward faster than expected, they had not waited, they had not questioned, they had assumed control and acted on it immediately, and I set the phone down gently on the table, my fingers resting lightly against its surface as I allowed that realization to settle, not with frustration, not with anger, but with quiet certainty, because this was exactly the moment I had been preparing for, The moment when their confidence would carry them just far enough to reveal everything, and I walked toward the window, pulling the curtain aside slightly, looking out at the parking lot below, cars moving in and out without purpose, people passing by without knowing that somewhere, decisions were being made that would soon shift everything for someone else, and I found myself thinking about Daniel, not as the man he had become, but as the child he once was, the one who believed that certainty came from knowing all the answers, from assuming control meant understanding everything, and I realized that he had carried that belief into adulthood, never questioning whether there were parts of the story he had not been told, and now, that belief had led him exactly where I needed him to be, fully committed, fully exposed, and I turned away from the window, returning to the small desk where the phone rested, picking it up once more, not to call him, not to confront him, but to confirm what I already knew, opening the attached documents, scanning the details, the listing agent, the projected timeline, the language that made it clear they were acting as if they had full authority, and I could almost hear Rebecca's voice in those lines, precise, organized, confident, believing she had secured something that was never hers to begin with, and I closed the file, placing the phone back down with the same quiet control, because now there was nothing left to prepare, nothing left to verify, everything had aligned exactly as it needed to, and I sat down in the chair beside the desk, folding my hands in my lap, allowing the silence of the room to settle around me, not heavy, not uncertain, but steady, because I understood something clearly now. This was not about reclaiming anything, nothing had been taken from me, this was about revealing the truth at the exact moment it would carry the most weight. And that moment was approaching quickly, because once they moved from planning to action, once contracts were signed, once intentions became formal, there would be no room left for assumption, only for reality, and I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for just a moment, not out of exhaustion, but out of focus, because timing was everything, and I would not rush it, I would not interrupt what they were building on their own misunderstanding, I would let it stand just long enough to collapse under its own weight, and when that happened, when they realized what they had overlooked, what they had assumed without confirming, the truth would not need to be forced, it would simply be undeniable, and I opened my eyes again, the room still quiet, unchanged, but everything beyond it already in motion, and I knew then that the next time I saw Daniel, it would not be as the woman he dismissed at the dinner table, it would be as the one who held the only authority that had ever mattered. 3 days passed before the call came, and when my phone lit up with Daniel's name, I let it ring once, twice, just long enough to understand that this was no longer a casual conversation, this was urgency, and when I finally answered, his voice was different, not loud, not emotional, but strained in a way I had never heard before, controlled on the surface but carrying something underneath that he could not quite hide. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, and I could almost see him standing in the living room, phone in hand, Rebecca nearby, both of them trying to make sense of something that no longer aligned with their expectations, and I responded simply, "I am available this afternoon," my tone calm, steady, offering no indication that I already knew exactly why he was calling, and there was a brief pause on the line, as if he had expected resistance or hesitation, but finding neither unsettled him more than either would have. "Come to the house," he said finally, his voice firm again, trying to re-establish control, and I agreed without question, ending the call with the same quiet precision I had maintained throughout everything, because now the moment had arrived, not unexpectedly, not prematurely, but exactly when it needed to, and when I arrived later that day, the house looked unchanged from the outside, but the energy inside was entirely different, heavier, sharper, as if something invisible had fractured beneath the surface, and as I stepped through the door, Daniel was already there, standing near the dining table, his posture tense, his expression tight, while Rebecca stood slightly behind him, her composure still present, but thinner now, less certain. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching between us, not empty, but filled with everything that had not yet been said, and I walked in calmly, placing my purse on the table. Taking in the room without urgency, without hesitation, because I was not arriving to defend myself, I was arriving to reveal something they had failed to understand, and Daniel broke the silence first, his voice controlled but edged with confusion. "The realtor called this morning," he said, watching me closely, searching for something in my expression, perhaps guilt, perhaps denial, but finding neither. "They said there is an issue with the ownership," he continued, and there it was, the first crack, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and I met his gaze evenly, allowing a brief pause before responding, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because timing mattered even now. "There is no issue," I said calmly, my voice steady, and I saw it then, the flicker of frustration, of disbelief, because my certainty did not match his confusion. "Then why are they saying you are the primary authority on the property?" he pressed, his voice tightening slightly, and Rebecca stepped forward just enough to add, "We have already started the process." Everything was supposed to be finalized, her tone still composed, but no longer confident, and I turned my attention to her briefly, acknowledging her presence without giving her control of the moment, then back to Daniel, because this was where the truth needed to land, clearly, without force, without anger, "Because your father did not leave things the way you assumed," I said, each word measured, deliberate, and I watched as the realization began to form, slowly, unwillingly, as if his mind was trying to reject it before fully accepting it. "What are you saying?" he asked, quieter now, less certain, and I did not raise my voice. I did not move closer. I simply stood where I was, grounded in the certainty I had carried with me. "I am saying that nothing in this house was ever transferred out of my control," I replied, and the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not waiting, but heavy with understanding. Because in that moment, everything they had built their confidence on began to shift, not all at once, but enough for them to realize that the foundation beneath their assumptions was not what they believed it to be, and I did not need to say more, I did not need to explain every detail, because the truth was already doing its work, settling into the space between us, undeniable, irreversible, and as Daniel stood there, processing what I had said, I saw something change in his expression, not anger, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty, something he was not used to feeling, and for the first time since that dinner, he did not look at me as if I were someone to be dismissed. He looked at me as if he was beginning to understand that he had never fully understood me at all. Daniel did not speak immediately after my words settled between us, and for the first time since that dinner, the silence was no longer something he controlled, it was something he had to face, and I watched as he tried to reconcile what he believed with what he was now hearing, his eyes shifting slightly, his posture no longer as steady as it had been just days before, while Rebecca stood behind him, her composure thinning further, her usual certainty replaced by a quiet tension she could not quite conceal, and I did not move to fill that silence, I did not soften what had been said. Because there was nothing to soften, the truth did not require adjustment, it only required acknowledgement, and eventually Daniel exhaled slowly, as if grounding himself, trying to regain control of a situation that was no longer within his grasp. "That does not make sense," he said, his voice quieter now, less assured, and I inclined my head slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of where he stood, because I understood that what he was experiencing was not confusion alone, it was the unraveling of a belief he had already built his decisions upon, and I responded calmly, "It makes sense if you take the time to understand it," my tone even, not dismissive, not confrontational, but firm enough to leave no room for misinterpretation, and Rebecca stepped forward then, her voice carefully controlled, though there was a trace of urgency beneath it. "We have already started the process. There are documents, commitments," she said, as if those actions could somehow reinforce their position, and I turned to her fully this time, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Starting something does not make it yours to finish," I said quietly, and that was the moment the reality of the situation became unavoidable, because neither of them responded immediately, neither of them attempted to argue, and in that stillness, I saw it clearly, the shift, the recognition that everything they had assumed, everything they had acted upon, had been built without the authority they believed they held, and Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in understanding, a slow, reluctant acceptance that he had moved too quickly, assumed too much, and I did not step closer, I did not press the moment, because this was not about forcing an outcome. It was about allowing the truth to stand on its own, and after a long pause, he spoke again, his voice measured, stripped of the confidence it once carried. "Why did you not say anything sooner?" And I considered the question for a brief moment before answering, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted him to hear it clearly, without emotion clouding its meaning, "Because you had already decided who I was before you asked what was true," I said, and there was no accusation in my tone, only clarity. And that seemed to settle over him more heavily than anything else I had said, because it was not something he could argue with, not something he could dismiss, it was simply a reflection of his own actions, and I reached for my purse then, lifting it from the table with the same calm I had carried through every step of this, because there was nothing more to explain, nothing more to prove, everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed, and I looked at him one last time, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet finality. "You called me a burden," I said, my voice steady, unshaken. "Now you will have to carry what you tried to take on your own." And I turned toward the door without waiting for a response, because I did not need one. The silence behind me was answer enough, and as I stepped outside, the air felt clear, open, unchanged by everything that had just taken place, and I walked to my car without hesitation, without looking back, because there was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion, and as I started the engine, I understood something with complete certainty. I had not lost my place. I had not been removed, I had simply stepped out of a role they no longer deserved, and this time, when I drove away, it was not because I was leaving, it was because I was moving forward on my own terms, with everything exactly where it had always been, in my control.